Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, socialism with Chinese characteristic has been a phrase used for long, but it has once again become a buzzword at the ongoing 19th CPC Congress. What does China's solution offer to the world? And the ANO party, led by a populist Czech billionaire, won the Czech parliamentary election with 30% of votes. Can this media tycoon find coalition partners willing to promote his anti-eurozone, yet pro-EU and NATO policy? And we begin our program today in Beijing, where the 19th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party is taking place. General Secretary Xi Jinping has set the blueprint for China's development aspirations. Among many new terms and buzzwords is China Solutions. China is offering its knowledge and approach to solve the problems facing mankind in a world filled with isolationist sentiments. Where will China's success story go next, and what it would mean for the rest of the world?
A new era, a more confident China. General Secretary Xi Jinping spelled out a two-stage development plan through the middle of the century, promising a great modern socialist country. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is now viewed as having entered a new era, with the past 5 years having produced truly remarkable developments.
This new area will be an area of building on past successes to further advance our course and of continuing in a new historical context to strive for the success of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It will be an area of securing a decisive victory in building a moderately prosperous society in all respects and of moving on to all-out efforts to build a great modern socialist country.
Xi Jinping says socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new option for other countries who want to accelerate their development while preserving their independence. It offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solve the problems facing mankind, the China Solution.
China's solutions are pragmatism based on local knowledge, culture, and conditions. It's not based on a single model. It's a model that can respond to change, and that's what makes it resilient. And that is a marked difference from a lot of the Western views, which are saying there's only one model, you have to follow it.
For the past 5 years, China has been playing a bigger role on the global stage. Promoting globalization, China has been more active in universal matters like UN peacekeeping and climate change. Together with Xi's concept of building a global community of common destiny, China has already taken the lead in a decade of isolationist and far-right tendencies.
So how does China hold up as a model of economic development as the 19th CPC National Congress ponders the future of the nation? With us to discuss that, we have a strong panel in Beijing studio. First of all, Fu Jun, the academic dean of the Institute for South Cooperation and Development from Peking University. Welcome, sir. Joining us in Shanghai, we invited with pleasure Martin Rack, who is a senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, also author of the book When China Rules the World. Martin, it's wonderful to see you today. And also joining us in Washington, D.C., good to see you. In the U.S., we have Joe Rubin, longtime friend, of course, of this program, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and now President of the Washington Strategy Group. Welcome, sir. Last but certainly not least, joining us in Nairobi in Africa, Peter Gawanja, the Chief Executive at the Africa Policy Institute and a former advisor to the Kenyan government. Wow, gentlemen. So we have people coming from Asia, Africa, North America, and certainly Europe as well. What a welcome to all of you. So let's figure out, is there something called China model, and what is likely, if there is, its significance for itself and also for the rest of the world? Let me go to Martin first. I mean, you wrote a book with a shining title called even China Rules the World. When people look at that title, they feel scared. But, you know, of course you didn't mean that. You're meaning that China is rising up. Do you think there is a China model?
Yes, I do. But I think it's got to be considered as in a very flexible, a very pragmatic way. I mean, essentially, it's been a hybrid. It's learned a lot of things from other parts of the world. It's learnt from the old Asian tigers, as it were. It learnt to some extent from the West, and of course right in the center of it is China's own experience of development. As a result, you know, we now can talk in terms of a China model. Not a model that everyone else should copy, but a model that offers possibilities and solutions if applied in the right way in different countries. And I think this is an extraordinary development, and I think it's worth just remembering, you know, that this word socialism became really out of fashion for a long time. And around the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and so on, you know, that victory of capitalism, end of socialism. And look where we are now, completely different situation.
Well, whether the China model is likely to be a competing model with what is already existing in the rest of the world, that certainly is an interesting topic, isn't it? Mr. Rubin, coming from the U.S., what's your perception?
Well, it's great to be with you, and thank you for having me on today to discuss this. One cannot overstate the significance of the President's words and the concept of a new era and of China really taking a note of its presence on the world stage. But like everything, when one asserts itself globally, it creates more questions necessarily than answers. And we will see the results of this related to China's participation in international security. Will China work with the international community at the United Nations in a manner that is in sync with the multiple countries, for example, in East Asia that have concerns about a reassertive China? What about the local development and the local issues inside of China? And when questions arise of democracy and autonomy, Taiwan, Hong Kong, these are all going to put strain on the China model, and it's good strain to have, frankly. It's good for China to be in this role, but it's going to test this vision, and it is going to be different going forward from what we've seen in the past years.
Jun, here in Beijing, it seems that what Joe is trying to suggest is that China is likely to be examined both from inside and also from outside, as it's exercising its international relations in this, what the Chinese Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party named as the new era, or it's going to be examined inside as China is moving forward toward the next stage, so-called moderately prosperous society. That is the goal in a few years. So what do you think about that double kind of examination, quote unquote, and what does China model mean in that way?
Well, to me, at the risk of oversimplification, there are two dimensions to the concept of China model. One is sort of the connection between the global vision and the local conditions. And if China has learned something from past experiences, we have opened up our system, that is the global vision. But when we learn for the ideas that we learn from the rest of the world, we also combine the ideas with the local condition, and this is very important. This is the sort of issue that China talks about. It's a combination of both the theory and the practice. Now, there is another dimension to the Chinese model. If you think of the two axes, one is the state, one is the market. And to be fair to the Chinese model is so far the state dimension continued to be very prominent relative to the market condition. And it probably makes sense for China because we have been moving from a state-dominant central planning system to a market-oriented system. So if you take a static view, the state continued to play a very important role, and this is very important for developing countries to catch up in terms of economic performance. When you are having a lot of shortage in terms of infrastructure, the things, probably it makes sense for the state to play a relatively big role.
Interesting points there. I want to throw those points also to our African guests. Peter, what do you think the two things that Jun here in Beijing mentioned? One is, of course, learning and adapting. That seems to be one thing that China has been working on quite successful so far. And the other thing is the role of the market, role of state evolving all the time given the conditions of the time. Peter, your thought?
Yeah.
The China model is a very interesting one because of its dynamism. As it was stated earlier by one of my colleagues, it borrows heavily from a variety of environments, from the West to the Asian tigers to other successful models elsewhere. But the key issues that we are observing from here, Africa, is that it has an element of free market. In other words, the leadership of the market. But the second aspect is that there is a heavy role by the state in terms of harmonizing and creating the environment within which business is taking place. If you look at the liberal market, I think that's where China is trying to run away from, where there seems to be a conflict between the market and the politics, which is democracy. The two competitions do not reinforce each other. And I think that is a very interesting model.
Martin, most of our discussion so far has been focusing on the economy, mainly, and the social system. But actually, Martin, you mentioned at the very beginning, when it comes to security issues, when it comes to other issues, there also is a China model. If you look at some of the recent cases, let's just say South China Sea, Northeast Asia security situation involving North Korean nuclear program, Martin, can you help us to shed some light about, is there something like China model? Is that likely, that attitude, that approach going to work or not, Martin?
Well, I think that China actually is going to offer a very different kind of approach to international problems to existing and previous great powers. I don't expect China to behave, for example, in the manner of the United States. I think it'll bring the traditions, the customs, the values of China, historically and contemporarily, to its approach to foreign policy and international relations. I mean, I can't imagine a situation, for example, in the long run, where, when China's much more powerful than it is now, ringing the world with military bases like the United States has done. I think that for China, there'll be a much greater emphasis on the importance of relationships, cultural links, and so on, and of course, centrally, the importance of economic development, and in particular, development. So I think we should expect, and we already can see, a very distinctive approach by China to foreign policy and diplomatic relations of a very different tenor to those that we associate with the United States. And this is for very big, deep historical and cultural reasons.
Can you, Martin, pin it down for us? What exactly are you referring to?
Oh, well, I think that if you take, for example, China's relationship with Africa, or through Belt and Road and so on, I mean, its whole approach is to offer to other parts of the world, which by and large are less developed, the possibilities of a new kind of development. And so what China is doing is extending, if you like, the hand of assistance and friendship to help other countries on their path of development.
I see.
And so that is, if you like, the classic model of the last 5 years with Belt and Road, with the AIB, and so on. And of course, going back longer, its relationship with Africa. Now, this is very different, actually, from the way the United States and Europe, for example, has behaved towards Africa over a long historical period. So I think this is a classic example, but it's only one. I mean, if you take the question of Korea, the Chinese approach on Korea is, it seems to me, to have a huge merit, which is not to, keep threatening North Korea with, if necessary, war and so on, and carrying out constant military exercises over the peninsula and so on, but rather the importance of stepping back, North Korea stepping back and stopping its missile launches on the one hand, and on the other hand, the United States, in conjunction with South Korea, for instance, conducting constant or very regular military exercises.
I see. Some interesting examples raised by Martin. June in Beijing, what do you think, just the example of so-called double suspension, as Martin mentioned earlier, on the issue of Korea nuclear issue, is that going to be the solution? Is that also help us to understand China's way to urge parties to be, to be calm and also try to buy the time in order to figure out a golden middle way? Is that possible?
Well, precisely, I would say this is a Chinese proposal. Whether or not it can solve the North Korea problem, we still need time to see. But when I look at the contemporary international system, you see this global system is a reflection of a fluctuating balancing between liberalism and realism. For China,
you need to.
For China to enter the system before and after its economic reform program and opening up, before that, Chinese tend to be on the side of realism. But then when we enter the system, and increasingly so, if you look at the past 30 or 40 years, we have been a beneficiary of this by and large liberal global system, so that now as a reflection, Chinese or the Chinese government, when they look at international affairs, they tend to be tilted on the side of the liberals. In other words, the future is bright, and if we continue to play the game of multilateralism, globalism, everyone can gain. Now, specific to the case of North Korea, the same logic applies to the North Korea as well, whereas the U.S. side seems to be on the side of liberalism. So in the China, well, let's stop that, and in time, North Koreans probably will be educated, and they will become more rational.
I see Professor Fu coming in with a very intellectual approach. Joe, I know you really want to jump in and say a few words about that.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the remarks. It reminds me, interestingly, what China's policy is pursuing now is a version of China first, similar to what President Trump has called for, which is America first. And we've seen this over the years, where China has put its economic interests first and has advanced its economic relationships with Africa and with other countries around the world, not so much for development of these countries as much as for ensuring Chinese economic access. We've seen this throughout, where there are infrastructure projects done, but they're done with Chinese firms, and they're not necessarily done for local economic development and improvement. And that makes sense up to a point, but the international community, not just the United States, has been dedicated for decades to promoting economic development. China itself has benefited from it through World Bank loans over decades to build infrastructure and to help local communities in agriculture and water usage and energy investment. So there will come a moment, and it's coming soon, where China will be asked to play a broader role than perhaps just China first on its foreign policy, if it really wants to have that global leadership on the world stage.
Right. Martin, Joe, if I can, may I just follow up very briefly, Joe, if I can, very briefly to you. At the time when we all have noticed that there has been an apparent withdrawal of the United States under this administration from the international system and from internationalism, what is going to be this interesting relation between China and the United States when one is rising and want to participate and even lead on certain issues, climate change, for example, while another is not at the same time active, but also feel bitter and sweet, I guess, mixed when it comes to another active player on the stage coming up. Joe, how do you see this picture?
It's a great question, and I think we've already seen it in practice, where President Xi has been very adept at positioning China to replace the United States and on the international stage, be it by going to Davos and the World Economic Forum to state that China would continue to promote international trade, or by continuing to keep China in the Paris Climate Accord when the United States said it wanted to withdraw. These were very shrewd moves. It positions China well. Clearly, they're controversial even in the United States. There's a lot of bipartisan concern about American withdrawal from these leadership roles. The question now is, will China create its own initiatives and really begin to define what internationalism is, not just take advantage of, as it rightly did, take advantage of opportunities that present themselves.
Okay, Martin, let's have Martin in, please.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think this is already clear. We can see it now. I mean, Belt and Road is an extraordinary project. This is exactly, to me, the archetype approach that the Chinese will have, which is to seek to transform the circumstances of the great majority of the world, which is the developing world, where 85% of the world's population live, and to try and create new circumstances. And the truth is, you know, that the West has never really done that. You know, Marshall Aid, its equivalent, was to help Europe after the end of the Second World War. So I think that China's will have a very internationalist approach. And I disagree, by the way, with the argument that China's growth hitherto has essentially been just about China. I don't think that's right at all. I mean, you know, Chinese growth, especially since the Western financial crisis in 2007-8, is basically what's kept the global economy afloat. I mean, if you look at the figures, China's contributed about twice as much to global growth as the United States. And if you look at the African question, which goes back much further, then in my view, you know, China's had a much bigger effect than any of the Western countries over the last decade and a half in relationship to Africa. I think the point is here is this, that China understands the problems of a developing country in a way that the rich world do not. They know what's needed for development. That's what makes Belt and Road and AIB such powerful proposals.
Okay.
Because China is a developing country, so it knows what's involved.
Yeah. Peter, I know you've been working on your lines earlier, but I hope it works now, right now, from Africa. What about that? What exactly is China model for Africa? Meanwhile, is China being aggressive, as described by some of the other panelists, in terms of its approach? What is China's ultimate goal, do you think? Can Africa really benefit from the so-called China model or China approach? Peter. We still probably have some problems reaching to our African guests, but I want to throw the same question almost back to Jun here in Beijing. May I twist the question a little bit just to fit from your Chinese perspective? This is an interesting time, dramatic change. China rising, China want to offer its solutions. Others also seek help and support from China. But at the same time, there is an incumbent power like the United States. So how can China keep this balance? You know, many here in China are thinking about this question. On the one hand, constructive, offer the solutions, be as brave as possible to seek a new path. On the other hand, also make sure the others will not perceive China so-called as aggressive, as assertive, and also work together with the United States if the United States still wants to work together with the international community. How is that balance likely to be kept? This is such a delicate one, I have to say. Jun.
Well, I guess the first point is to have a very sharp observation of the structural forces that's sort of changing the global scene, and to understand the gradual rise of China. Actually, China has been moving towards a norm, global norm. Now, if you look at GDP per capita globally, average level, it's 12,000, and the GDP here in China, 8,000. So China continues. We have a long way to go, but of course China is a big country. If you look at the size of Chinese economy, it's number 2. So at the time, to me, it makes a lot of sense for China to serve as a bridge linking advanced economies and the less advanced economies. Even though our GDP continued to be a shade above 8,000, and we can have a very positive role to play. But if we continue to rise, I guess for many foreigners, they have a lot of psychological adjustment to make if they do not sort of have a sharp observation of the structural forces that are being changing. Historically, economic performance is more or less the same across all countries when we are all in the mode of agricultural production.
But now, of course, it's a very different age. It's an age of innovation that we are talking about here today, and it's really about globalization. Everybody's linked to everybody else. Before we go, I do want to have our panelists to help us understand with a sentence only, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Exactly what is China model to you, and will that be able to enrich the solutions we have for many of the challenges that we are facing today? Joe, let's go to you first.
The China model, to me, is one of self-confidence, of engaging the world in a moderate path. And it is one that does offer hope, but there are also significant risks, and those risks are, will China open itself up in ways that it is not necessarily comfortable with to fully engage the world in a meaningful way?
I see. Jun, here in Beijing.
China model is not a static model. It is very rich within China. We have a more market-oriented model in Zhejiang. We have a more foreign capital-oriented model in Shanghai, and we also have a more state dominant model in Jiangsu province. It's very rich.
It's a diversity of models, actually, we're talking about here, given China's size. And Peter, can I just really ask for one sentence from you about what is China model to you and to Africa? Very briefly, one sentence.
I think the highlight of China model to Africa is development of peace. The emphasis that development must take place within the context of peace. I think that's a great idea.
You know what, Peter, I'm so happy that we're finally eventually connected to you once again. Thank you so much. And Martin, last but certainly not least. Martin.
Well, I think firstly the China model has transformed China in a truly remarkable way. And I think that because I think the future looks very, very strong for China, increasingly China will become central in global affairs, and that the China model in some degree or another will become normative in a way that previously it's been an outlier. And this, of course, implies huge changes in the world, not just economically, but intellectually, politically, culturally, and so on.
This is a fascinating topic, I have to say, gentlemen, and all of you have been providing us with a lot of resourceful intellectual wisdom to think even further. I want to thank the four of you coming from all over the world. Joe Rubin from the U.S., Martin Jacques from Europe, Fu Jun here in China, and Peter Gawanja in Europe. Thank you so much, in Africa rather. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program, the ANO party, led by a populist Czech billionaire, won the Czech parliamentary election with 30% of the vote. Will the new prime minister follow others in Eastern Europe in challenging the European project of Brussels? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. The Czech centrist ANO movement, led by populist billionaire candidate Babis, has won the country's parliamentary election on Saturday. The ANO party raked about 30% of the vote for 78 seats in the 200-member parliament, but it may struggle to find coalition partners. Mr. Babis is a 63-year-old Slovak-born chemicals, food and media tycoon, has vowed to steer clear of the eurozone. He also echoes other Eastern EU leaders who accuses Brussels of attempting to limit national sovereignty by imposing rules like migrant quotas. But he favors a united Europe and balks at talk of a Czechit. So could the winning party of the Czech Republic turn to the right for Babis, the prime minister in waiting? Let's ask our panelists. We are joined by Jeremy Garlick, who is a lecturer in international relations at Jan Masaryk Center for International Studies of the University of Economics in Prague. And also in London, we invited Ian Begg, who is a professorial research fellow at the European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. I want to welcome both of you gentlemen for being with us. Well, shall we ask Mr. Garlick first, what happened? It seems that the far right is gaining so much in the Czech election. Nobody expected that, apparently.
Well, if I can just clarify initially that the party that has gained almost 30% ANO, which means yes in Czech, is led by Andrej Babis, is actually positioned as a center to center-right party. So they are not, at least on paper, they are not actually a far-right party. There is a second party in the election that gained about 10.5%, led by Tomio Okamura, who is a Czech who is half Czech, half Japanese, but is a Czech citizen. That party is more to the far right. So the question would be whether ANO is going to try to form a coalition with that party. Then we might see a leaning to the right. But as it stands at present, as far as I understand it, the ANO party is more to the center or center-right. So it's not such a kind of extreme swing to the right as we may have seen in other recent elections in Central Europe.
However, the possibility of forming a coalition government with a far right and the rise of the far right party, the gaining of more parliamentary seats, is still a surprise to many from other parts of the world. Mr. Garlick.
Well, to clarify again that the far-right party in the previous election had, led by Tomio Okamura, had about 6.5 or 6.8% of the vote. It's now gained about 10.5% of the vote. So that, yes, there's been an increase in that vote, but I think what viewers need to understand is that the Czech political scene is really quite complex and fragmented. Because of the proportional representation system. There are actually 9 parties, which is a record, and 9 parties have gained seats in this election by gaining 5% or more of the vote. So we actually have a very confused picture at the moment. And not all of those parties are from the right of the sphere. It's true that 2 of the leftist parties' vote went quite down, and the previous ruling Social Democrats lost a large part of their seats. But there are some other parties that have come up. To me, actually more surprising is the rise of the Pirates, who are a kind of civil, in campaigning for liberal rights and civil rights. So they've actually come up even more than the Okamura party. They actually have about the same amount of the vote. So the far right party is actually only in 4th place. But of course, yes, it's a concern that there may be a swing in that direction.
All right, Mr. Begg, I want you to join in because Mr. Garlick is certainly looking at the Czech situation more locally, but what we are talking about seems to be a trend that we have seen in elections in many capitals so far, different kinds of countries in Europe. The far right, whether you say it's the 4th largest, or it's gaining 30%, or it's gaining 50% of seats in one country or another, or it's likely to come into the coalition government, all of these are ringing the bells once and again. Are we going to see that's people's concern? The history repeated that in Europe decades ago, there were, before the war, the trend against the immigrants, the trend against certain kinds of race. And we see that eventually evolved after years going on into something dramatic and certainly horrific. And people are asking the question, are we going to see the history repeated? Is there any concern about that?
Well, I think I agree with Mr. Garlick that it's still a small minority who are voting for the extreme right. It's only 12%. And the ANO party, which has won the overwhelming proportion of the seats, it's gained 78 out of 200, and by far the biggest party, has already said it's not going to go into coalition with the SPD, which is the right-wing, very right-wing party. We see more in Austria last week. I think the Czech position is not dissimilar to Germany, where you saw the AfD in Germany gains of the order of 12%, but all the other parties saying, no, we're not going to form a coalition with them. So we have this confused picture, 9 parties in the Czech Republic, ANO very much in the lead, but having to rely on at least one other party and possibly 2 other parties to form a governing coalition. The paradox is that you could well find exactly the same 3 parties in the next Czech coalition, which is the centre-right, the ANO party and the centre-left, as was in the previous coalition, with the further paradox that the claim that Babis made when he was trying to be elected was he was the party of change, and yet he was the one coming from government. He's a previous finance minister. So it's very, very confusing. I don't think we should draw too alarming a lesson from this about the far right gaining ascendancy in Europe. It just isn't. It's arithmetically a small minority.
But we still see the impact that some of the far right parties has created. Even the winning party that we start talking about, the majority, they are also talking about anti-immigrants and anti-eurozone and yet pro-Europe. So how are we going to read these mixed messages coming from different political parties? And will that eventually influence the overall landscape, political landscape in the eurozone or about the eurozone itself, the European Union itself? Mr. Begg, briefly.
Well, I think that there is an unsolved problem at European level about migrants and refugees. And the difficulty that we have there is that because the European level hasn't succeeded in getting a common policy, you find all these reactions going on in member states. Now, the Czech Republic has very few migrants. It's quite a homogeneous society. It's unlike Austria, where the migrant route was very much through Austria, and that has triggered what we saw last week there. Now, for the Eurozone, you should remember as well that the Czech Republic has been one of the few countries which has been very strongly against joining the Euro. Its previous president, Václav Klaus, was very hostile to the Euro. Indeed, if you hear him in public, he can be very savage about the Euro as a construction. I was once on a panel with him where he was saying very negative things about the Euro. Czech Euroscepticism, as practiced by this new party, the ANO party, is rather limited because the Czechs recognize they gain from being in Europe. And I think that it's far better to think of the ANO party led by Babis as one which is populist but in a business-orientated way rather than pandering too much to fear of migrants.
Mr. Babis' party, ANO, or ANO, as you said, won nearly 30% of the vote in the election on Friday and Saturday. That's nearly 3 times as much as its closest rival. But many parties expressed reluctance about forming a coalition with it, while Mr. Babis fights off fraud charges or rejected the idea outright. Now let's go to you, Mr. Garlick. Some suggest the Czech politics has been very much a firm base of democracy, and people have been also talking about, you know, Czech has been a country that's been moving smoothly, but still through this election, people say they see some signs of concerns. What is this to you when you are doing research about your country's politics?
Well, I think the situation in the Czech Republic is one in which the Czech people are quite a pessimistic kind of people about, you know, they're often dissatisfied with the politicians that they have and the system that they have. So I think what this election represents is an expression of dissatisfaction with the status quo by certain portions of the population. It's quite a volatile situation. It's quite complex. It's not easy to solve. But I think we do see a move away from the mainstream, old mainstream parties towards more rising, you know, so-called populist parties that represent an alternative to the status quo. Particularly, let's say, younger people are looking for an alternative to the older parties. This is why, as I say, the Pirate Party, which represents you know, e-commerce and e-government has got, I think, a large portion of the vote from young people. So what we see is a move away from traditional politics towards a kind of more populist kind of politics.
Against the refugees, against the Muslims, and also against the so-called rotten establishment. That seems to be the phrases that we have seen over and again in the European elections over the past 2 years. Mr. Beck, we only have very few time left. Can you help us understand, is this going to be the future trend of European politics, and what would that mean eventually for the overall existing policy frameworks that both the EU embraces and also the member countries embrace?
Well, there are probably two quick answers to this in too short a time. The first is that until Europe collectively solves the problem of how to manage the refugee challenge, we'll see a repeat of these kinds of objections. But with this odd paradox that countries like Poland or the Czech Republic, which seems to be resisting migrants, simply don't have them. They're concerned about the fear of it. What you're also seeing is some reassertion of what I might call a Central European identity. The Czech Republic, the Poles, the Hungarians, and to some extent the Austrians are showing similar trends in their economies. But it's rapidly evolving, and I would not make too much of saying there's a new Eastern European or Central European populist bloc. Rather, it's domestic politics which are trying to change things. Some regard the arrival of Babis as being the new Trump. I would disagree with that. I think he's much more like a different politician, of not particularly strong repute, which is Silvio Berlusconi.
All right. Well, things are complicated. Again, it's in each country's politics, but overall, does it really suggest something when they're combined together? Thank you so much, both of you. Jeremy Garlick and Ian Beck, thank you. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for Insights across China and around the world. Good night.